Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome back to another episode of Book Musings. This is episode 5. I'm going to take a look at George Orwell's Animal Farm. As I usually do in these episodes, I'm going to give you a little bit of background in terms of why it is I'm reading, or in this case, why I listen to Animal Farm at this time. I'll give you an overview of what happens in the novel or novella. So, spoiler alert, there will be, I will be talking about what happens in the book, and I'll give you some thoughts, some general thoughts, some musings, if you like. I'll highlight some prevalent themes and kind of offer some reflections on those. And I'll conclude by, as I usually do, offering my book musings grade. We'll see if Orwell's Animal Farm has what it takes to make the book musings Hall of Fame. Maybe even it'll be the first entrant onto the highly coveted top shelf. We shall see. So, as I mentioned, a little bit of background in terms of why it is I'm listening to Animal Farm, or why I did. So, if you watched episode 4, you know that I discussed Orwell's arguably his most famous work, 1984. And in that book, or in that episode, I discussed how I oftentimes like to listen to audiobooks as I run. I'm a runner, and it makes the time go by really fast. And so I, for whatever reason, got into 1984, listened to that one, and I knew immediately that I was going to want to revisit Animal Farm. And then up next, I'm actually halfway through this one already. So I finished this about a week ago. I just haven't had time to make a video on it. And before that, just like all three of these, I don't know if you're the same, but these have always been kind of associated in the back of my mind. I've always thought very highly of all three, but it had been quite some time since I'd actually read any of them. It had been, in fact, multiple decades, at least 2 decades. And so it was interesting. I talked about in the last episode how this turned out after going through it again, how it turned out to be a little bit different than what I remembered it, how I remembered it being at times, at least. And so, I was curious to see if that would be the same for this, and then so too Brave New World. But anyway, I had been familiar with these and always had thought really highly of them, but it had been a long time ago. So I came into Animal Farm with some familiarity, recalling that I had, this sort of vague recollection that I did really enjoy it. I want to say it was in high school, and that again, it was one of the ones that I remember really liking. Also, a quick point while I'm thinking about it. So I mentioned that I listened to 1984 and Animal Farm this time around, and I just got to say that how great of a job. In this case, it was Timothy West. I forgot to look up who it was. It might be the same guy, actually. They sound very similar. Who it was, whose version it was that I listened to for 1984. But these guys are awesome. I know that in another video or two that I've done, I've talked about, I think anyway, how I will listen to philosophy at times, on my runs. In fact, I had a project to listen to all of Nietzsche's works. Well, that didn't go so well. What I found out, so I was trying to go through them in chronological order, and I only made it to the Gay Science or the Joyful Wisdom, which is like the second or third book of his, and I just couldn't take it. The guy, and I'm not going to name names or anything, but the narrator, the guy reading it, just it was, the cadence. It was hard to follow what was being actually said, and not to mention parsing what Nietzsche is actually saying in a philosophical sense and trying to figure out, what he's getting at. And not to mention that Nietzsche is writing in German in the first place. So there's this whole other issue of translations entering the equation, making things even, harder to figure out. The point being, it was a totally different experience. I basically concluded I can't listen to Nietzsche being read. I have to tackle it myself. I have to go through it, and that might even be true philosophy in general. It's different maybe than, clearly it's not as you don't need to be as meticulous in your thinking as you're following along as you do when you're listening to this, as you do, when you're listening to Nietzsche. So again, just I wanted to reflect on it and mention how awesome and great these narrators were. Specifically, Timothy West is the narrator, the one the reader of Animal Farm, the one I listened to, and did a great job just capturing the different characters and their voices, and it really did like brought it alive, if you will. Made me want to. I was looking forward to my runs because then I could get back into the story. And conversely, I think I mentioned in 1984, I actually was so into it, I would find my spot on my computer and where I was for my run, find my spot on my computer at home and listen to it while doing chores. With this one, I decided no, I'm just going to wait and only do it on my run so that I really have something to look forward to. And it worked. It made me want to go out there and run even more. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. So that's a little bit in terms of the background, or why it is I came to listen to this. Again, it's because it was preceded by me uh, revisiting 1984 and enjoying that kind of experience of going back and again revisiting some of these classics. So I want to do the same with Animal Farm, and I am doing the same. In fact, I'm 2/3, maybe even further through Brave New World already. But so anyway, what is the book about? Let's go ahead, and again, there will be spoilers. I am going to talk about what the book is about. So be forewarned, if you haven't ever read this yourself, or you don't want spoilers, you might want to turn it off now. But anyway, so what is the book about? Fascinating. I love the tale that Orwell spins here. It's basically documents a rebellion on the part of the animals. Mr. Jones is the farmer, and he has his workmen that work for him. They get sick of their conditions, the animals do, and they rebel against Mr. Jones and his workers. And it actually begins, the novella begins with old Major, this pig, who's basically on his deathbed. He dies a few days later. He delivers a speech to all the animals on the farm, and it was an amazing beginning. It basically says all of our problems are the result of human beings. If we just removed humans from the equation, we would actually flourish. But all of our oppression, our issues, look how hard we work, and we barely, get what we create, what we work hard for. All of that is a result of the human being. So please, fellow animals, make it your ideal, right, to overthrow, to get rid of this human influence from our lives. And so the animals go about doing just that. It's surprisingly easy. It happens very early on in the book, where they are able to oust Mr. Jones, who is turns to drink, is basically an alcoholic, and lets the farm. It doesn't take good care of the farm. The workers don't feed the animals, and that's ultimately what leads them over the edge, right, where the rebellion actually begins, is because they're not being fed appropriately. And so again, this rebellion takes place. It's surprisingly easy, and so then I think it really gets interesting, because what immediately happens? Well, you get this immediate power struggle. The pigs immediately start kind of running the show, but within the pigs, right, this sort of elite class, if you will, of animals, you have, again, this power struggle between Snowball in particular, this loquacious sort of idealist, and then Napoleon, who's kind of this ruthless, conniving, militaristic minded individual. And so you see this kind of play out with their totally different sort of ways of trying to gain power, if you will. Of course, for Snowball, it's not about gaining power. That's part of his appeal. And so anyway, they're constantly at odds, and this sort of boils over when Napoleon is able to. He was secretly sort of raising these dogs and become vicious dogs. He was secretly raising them, and basically is able to get Snowball off the farm by having these dogs chase him off. And from that point forward, he basically turns into a tyrant. And you see the farm become more and more totalitarian, authoritarian, and you get Squealer, this other pig, who's basically like a propagandist for Napoleon, basically manipulating all the animals and conditioning them. And I'll say more on this as we go, but to to adopt, right, whatever policies are in favor of the pigs in general, but specifically, Napoleon, the one who's really controlling everything. And so I think it's just fascinating how, this all takes place, and it's kind of this gradual process, one step at a time, and slowly but surely, though, what ends up happening as the novella progresses is they end up being back. It's like a full circle, right back from whence they came, the animals, that is. They're at a point where they're working harder than they've ever worked and receiving less than they've ever received. And yet the humans aren't involved, or they're involved very little, right? It's just another oppressor that's in place. And so I think, the implications of that, what's Orwell trying to tell us? I think I'll discuss that more as we proceed. But I think that's got some interesting implications, right? Does it not matter ultimately what we do, because whoever ultimately takes charge, somebody that's kind of ruthless in nature, is going to climb their way to the top, and crap's going to hit the fan until people rebel, and then the same thing happens again. Is that the upshot here? At any rate, that's a kind of general picture of what takes place here. I'll say more about the ending later, but I really do like the ending, although it's very abrupt. Again, I'll speak more to that at the end, but I love how, like I said, in the end, the novella ends with this notion that the other animals can no longer tell pigs apart from humans, right? It's this idea that power corrupts, right? That it doesn't matter who you put in charge, right? They're gonna inevitably turn out to be greedy and manipulative and so on, to the point where they're indistinguishable with any prior ruler, right? So that seems to be, again, the kind of implication as the ending of the novella suggests. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just discuss a few prevalent themes, some of which I've already alluded to here. I guess I'll go ahead and start again with that idea that the implication seems to be, right, that it doesn't matter who we put in charge. Is it just human nature or animal nature that we're greedy ultimately, or that some element of the ruling class is going to be greedy, or maybe we're not all greedy, but somebody who is greedy is going to be able to climb their way ultimately to the top no matter what. But that greedy sort of element is always present, and in some sense inevitable. It's inevitable that it will at times rise to the top and control and manipulate things. That seems to be, again, a major idea here at play, because we started with the humans, look what happened. We go to the pigs, look what happened. I mean, will it be any different if we rely on a different, species? Probably not, ultimately. Maybe it'll take a little bit more time, maybe not. But, I do like that idea, and I've kind of thought about that a lot myself. Is it something deeply ingrained in our biology, if you will, to just try to hoard power, right? And maybe it's just inevitable. We start off with maybe like Snowball with these grand ideals, but maybe even Snowball, the more power he amasses, maybe he even would have ended up assuming some of these same tyrannical methods that Napoleon adopted. So you get that idea again a lot, I would say, in Animal Farm, that whoever's put in charge, especially if they're given too much power, it's going to corrupt, and that's not a good recipe. Which is interesting as well in terms of what do we do in terms of our government with that in mind, right? It seems like he would be one for whom lots of checks and balances are needed. If you're going to have a government in place, you better make darn sure that that whoever has that power, right, and is making the decisions within that government, that they're not becoming too greedy, that they don't have too much power, lest this sort of thing happen, right? What happens in Animal Farm? We find ourselves in a totalitarian regime where we have to bend to every whim of the dictator. right? And the case here, Napoleon. Another interesting and prevalent theme is kind of the manipulation and control of history, and I'll talk about some similarities between the two works here, but that was definitely prevalent in both of these novels. By the way, 1984 was, I think, published in 1949, and this was 1945. So Animal Farm was published a few years prior, and the similarities are definitely there, and I'll talk more about that later. But this one in particular, manipulation control of history, which I talked a lot about in episode 4, is definitely present here, and you see it with Napoleon's rise to the top. And you might say, is that always at play when whoever's in charge rises to the top? Are they doing this? Is this part of what it takes to assume power? In our historical examples, I'm interested in that. But any case, that's at play here, right? So you get the constant tweaking of sort of what's proper, right? So they start with like all humans are, let's get rid of all human habits and ways. Like for example, don't no alcohol. 2 legs are bad. 4 legs are good. 2 legs are bad. That sort of thing. But then over time, Napoleon starts, in particular, and the pigs in general, they start adopting. They start finding the allure of alcohol and all these other things. They start walking on their 2 legs, or trying to walk on just their hind legs on 2 legs, and in the process, right, they have to spin things so that everyone's convinced, well, that's how it always was, right? We've always preferred, no, 2 legs, walking on 2 legs, even though it was clearly not the case, right? The whole rebellion was against humans and everything human related, right? Alcohol, walking on 2 legs, what else? Bed, not using beds and so on. And over time, again, Napoleon and the pigs, they started adopting all these human habits and justifying them by manipulating the animal's recollection, the sense of history that they had. They paint these 7 commandments, if you will, on the barn. Well, it started off as 7 commandments, but then they ended up, just turning into one. And it's funny how these are kind of manipulated over time. All animals are equal turns out to be, in the end, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And to get the message across that Napoleon wants, you get this what's the word, repetition, right? This, which is key in propaganda, just hammer home the message. And so you get the sheep. I love this throughout the story. The sheep are always bleeding out whatever message the pigs want. And so it starts off, when they were wanting the rebellion against the humans. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. But in that, the message that the sheep are sending out, it changes through the story, and it ends up being 4 legs good, 2 legs better, right? And so again, that just speaks to the controlling regime and the methods that are used, right? Propaganda, repetition, however you want to put it, controlling and manipulation of history, acting as if, what happened in the past. Like, for example, Snowball was very, all the animals saw how courageous Snowball was in the original rebellion. But then the pigs and Squealer, they talk as if, over time, they tweak little details of the historical account of that battle to the point in the end where he was always a traitor. Snowball was, right? He was never any good. That sort of thing is happening constantly on the part of Napoleon and his, fellow regime, right? Squealer, again, his propagandist in particular, is the one sent out to disseminate these messages, and he's the one, again, manipulating this sense of history. And again, I just love how that happens, and how there's so many instances of it too, where they start, even the name of the farm, Manor Farm, goes to Animal Farm very early on, but then it ends up being Manor Farm, which was proper all along, according to Napoleon. So again, that idea that we'll just spin it however we want to at whatever time we find ourselves at. We'll just talk about history as if it was one way when it was actually completely different. And the animals are, they're confused. They feel like they have a different sense of what happened, but then over time, after being told so many times that Snowball, no, he wasn't a hero. In fact, he was a traitor. That's all they remember over time. And they're not as intelligent. That's very clear and made palpable throughout the novel. And so they understand that to some degree too, that the pigs are good in some sense of figuring things out. And so, well, I must be wrong, right? If this is what these guys are saying, well, that's clearly what happened, even though it wasn't. So that idea, again, of manipulating, controlling history to suit the powers that be, that definitely is a prevailing theme throughout Animal Farm. Another prevailing theme that I alluded to in episode 4 when I was talking about 1984, and I mentioned that I'd probably explore it in more detail in this episode because it's definitely a prevailing theme throughout Animal Farm. That's the idea of paternalism. Talking about the pigs and how even the other animals had this sense that they understood the pigs were intelligent and were better at figuring things out, and that speaks to paternalism right there. So, what is this idea of paternalism if you're not familiar? It's basically the justification of interference in someone's behavior. So you're interfering and it's in an unwanted sense. So that's the first ingredient, right? They don't want you to interfere. They don't want to have to do what you're making them do, or they want to do something that you're not allowing them to do. So your interference is unwanted. And the other key ingredient is that it's for that person's own good. That's why you're doing it. Okay. And so you get that sort of justification throughout the novel, right? That here's what we have to do, and you might not always like it, but it's for our best interests. The squealer, the pigs in general, and Squealer, the propagandist in particular, is always saying these sorts of things to the other animals. I referenced this quote is very telling. I referenced actually in the episode 4 video. I referenced this quote as well. This is paternalism coming out of the voice of Squealer. He's speaking to the other animals and trying to persuade them, why they have to sort of be willing to embrace what the pigs say they have to do, no matter what. He says, okay, so this is the bottom of page 59 in my version of the Animal Farm here. So he's talking about Napoleon. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves, but sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades. And then where should we be? Right? So look, we have to decide these things for you because otherwise you'll screw up. Okay, so it's in your own interest to allow us to determine how much of our crop you get to, consume each day and so on. And so again, that's appealing to this idea of paternalism. Well, this is something that I have a lecture on this. John Stuart Mill speaks to this. Again, I mentioned this in my episode on 1984. I think there's notorious issues associated with paternalism, and they shine through in Animal Farm then, right? What happens when you give control and power to, a group, and you're basically suggesting they're like a parent, right? So what's going on in paternalism, if you think about it, is whoever's interfering in the behavior of the other is acting like the parent, like they're the reasonable one, right? And the other then who's being interfered with is, at least what's implied, is that they're like a child. They don't know any better. They would otherwise at least act irrationally. And I think, the allure of paternalism is there at least to some degree for almost everyone, if you think about it, right? I mean, think about, after all, a parent with a child. We can't just let kids do whatever they want, or they'd be staying up all night. They'd be eating candy. Trust me, my 5-year-old tries to sneak candy all the time as it is. If I just let her do whatever she wanted, she would be eating candy literally all the time. She probably wouldn't have any teeth. And that's the issue, right? That's where paternalism gains some ground, or it seems justified to some degree. But it becomes problematic, at least I would argue, when we start applying it to one another meaning not kids, right? Adults. And so for example, when you get sort of paternalistic measures, say in government policy, so like you can't gamble, you can't have poker night, your neighborhood poker night because it's not good for you, or you can't engage in prostitution because it's not good for you. I mean, what other rationale or justification is there? You're not, in these cases where, let's say, due to government policy, you can't do something, and it's not because it would be harming other people. It's not. It's only ostensibly, I guess the implication is, given the policy that you can't do it, ostensibly it's only hurting yourself, right? So that's paternalistic in that sense. The government's intervening, saying you can't gamble, you can't engage in prostitution, you can't smoke marijuana because it's not in your own interest. Right? So there's that intervention, and the presumption again is that it's because it's in your own interest, your own interest. But that becomes very problematic because, again, who's going to decide what is rational, right? Who gets to play the role of the parent? Because implicit in that sort of excuse me, policy is the idea that someone would otherwise be acting irrational. The people that want to gamble, the people that want to engage in prostitution or smoke marijuana, that's irrational. But who gets to decide that sort of thing? And aren't there debates about those issues and whether or not they are in fact good? Is there a consensus about that? There's not, is there? And that's the problem. How can you institute? There's going to be problems. Let's just put it this way. I think there's going to be problems when you try to institute government policy that's paternalistic in nature when you're applying it to adults. And John Stuart Mill talks about that. I'll provide a link to my lecture where I reference this sort of thing, where he talks about the kind of issues associated with paternalism. What kind of things can be regulated, assuming you or interfered with respect to, right? So is it, should we allow the government, how far do you want to take it, right? If you're going to start, this is another issue. If you're going to allow this sort of these paternalistic measures on the part of the government, how far do you want to take it? I mean, fast food isn't good for any of us, but do we want to allow the powers that be to just remove fast food? New York, I don't know the policy now, but they used to have a state policy for a while where you couldn't buy a soda of a certain size. It had to be X amount of ounces or less. And that's paternalistic, right? Because it's not good for you to, and it's true, it's not good. These things aren't good for you. And these are what's interesting. These are cases where we can all agree this isn't good for you, and yet we still become upset when someone comes in and tries to say, you can't do that, right? We still want the freedom in these cases to eat our fast food, to stay up past midnight, to drink the soda. And in fact, what people started doing was they just ordered, multiple smaller sizes. So we have issues even when it's clear that, yeah, it is harming myself to do this, but I don't want you to interfere. We have issues with that. But what about cases where it's not even clear, right? Is it harming me to engage in, to gamble? What if I'm a good poker player, right? So, I think I would definitely argue that there are a slew of issues associated with paternalism, at least when trying to apply it to grown adults, right? And again, John Stuart Mill speaks to these issues, and that's why I think in part why he offers his famous harm principle, this idea that we shouldn't interfere in the behavior of others unless what they're going to do is going to harm others. Okay, so if it's merely going to harm themselves, the person that's going to do it, if it's merely self-regarding, as he would say, and it's not other-regarding, the harm doesn't affect others, then we ought to allow them to do what they're going to do. Because he says ultimately it's far greater evil to constantly be intruding in the affairs of everyone, even when in instances where you're right and they are hurting themselves. It's a far greater evil to constantly be meddling in people's affairs. We're better off letting people screw up, okay, even in these instances where they are harming themselves. That's better than, again, this complete seeming lack of freedom constantly, where you're constantly being interfered with. Nobody likes that. So I guess an interesting example again with that soda, right, where people have an issue with paternalism when it's been employed. I would say that's definitely, there's definitely examples of that. And I would say the problems with paternalism become manifest in what happens in the story itself in Animal Farm. When you give a group that kind of power to make kind of paternalistic choices, I think ultimately that's going to end up spiraling out of control, and it is going to end up yielding a kind of totalitarian regime, an authoritarian regime. Whereas, if you don't sort of proceed in such a paternalistic fashion, from a government sense, but maybe more along the lines of Mill's harm principle, only having a policing force in place to go and do something when people are harming others, right? Rather than trying to dictate, these paternalistic measures like you can't drink soda, X amount of soda, and so on. Maybe that's a better sort of approach to instantiating a government, right? A one that's actually viable and that will maybe be long lasting. Otherwise, again, if you allow a faction of people, or if you allow the ruling faction to install paternalistic policies, you're going to allow them in a much, I would say, allow them to take a lot of control in a much quicker fashion. So anyway, and that was a worry, by the way, this notion, is it possible to avoid totalitarian regimes, and how do we best do that? I think that was an ever-present worry for Orwell. If you dig into sort of, why he wrote these novels in the first place. So I guess general point there is, I do think there's like this connection between paternalism and that sort of justification with respect to government policy and governments that fall into totalitarianism, right, and become overly authoritarian. I think that where that's the case, that that it was likely because they were allowed to adopt and enforce paternalistic measures. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so a little bit about my thoughts. I would say very similar, as I alluded to earlier, to 1984. I mean, you can see the parallels throughout. They run deep. I mentioned earlier in the manipulation of history. That's a very common theme throughout both of these, right? Sort of tweaking everyone's recollection of what happened to suit the agenda of whoever's in power. That happens in both of these, and it's happens commonly, and that makes sense. It's I talked about that in the 1984 episode. This idea of controlling the past. There's a great amount of power in that, because then you're sort of able to steer what people do now, right? Because they think, well, this sort of thing happens based on what happened in the past, or what we think happened in the past. I don't want that thing to happen, so I better not do X, Y, Z. And if you're a government that doesn't want them to do X, Y, Z, well, then paint the picture of history in such a way, because then they won't do X, Y, Z. Another common theme is like the plasticities. What I just said speaks to this as well. The plasticity, the malleability of the masses in general, and how easily we can be conditioned and manipulated. We're a little sure at first, but over time, with enough repetition, no, it didn't really happen that way. It happened this way. Well, how often does that actually happen in our own lives? Who knows? But that is a common idea throughout both of these books as well. And I guess one final sort of similarity, one that I guess I would say is unfortunate. If there's one thing I could change about Orwell's body of work, at least so far as I'm familiar with it, depressing endings. Both of them, I would say, have very, very depressing endings. Not much optimism for those who, think about the issues that come to the forefront within these books. There's not much optimism that Orwell offers us. So indeed, like 1984, Animal Farm does not have a happy ending. It's here to deliver cold, sobering truths that aren't pretty, and that are difficult to swallow, indeed. So if you're looking for optimism, definitely turn elsewhere, I would say. But if you're looking for, deep reflection on maybe I don't know how realistic or true a lot of this is, but it seems to be, at least in my reflections. You're here to pursue the truth, and not necessarily want that. We'd all like a happy ending, right? But if what concerns you more is truth, then I think it would behoove you to at least entertain some of the ideas that are brought forward in both of these. So again, he's not here to necessarily, I would say he's here to entertain us, and he does entertain us, but to make us walk away. He's not here to make us walk away with smiles, right? He's here to make us walk away thinking. And I definitely, and that's one thing I love about Orwell. I just wish I could be smiling while I walk away thinking, but he does leave you thinking. Okay? Throughout, while you're reading the books or listening to the books, you will be thinking throughout them. I'd say that of the two, I'd actually say this is probably better because it delivers a lot of the same messages, but in a much shorter length, which in my mind, I guess you could argue that both ways because it is so good, actually. So a couple things here. I really do like the narration, the story, the characters in Animal Farm, even way more so than I'd say in 1984. And so in some sense, it'd be nice if I got more of that, right? If it did go on and was twice as long, right? But on the other hand, I think that it speaks to his ability as a writer, that he's able to pack just as much of a punch, though, in such a short novella, right? And what is this? 128 pages. So I guess that could be both a plus and a minus. That it is so short, but it is short and sweet. It really does pack a nice punch. I mean, what he's able to make you think about in such a short work is amazing. And again, being able to do that while at the same time, like getting you gripped or immersed in the story itself and what's happening and these characters, just awesome. I mean, he's a great writer. No doubt about it. I did want to say again, back to that ending, it does kind of end abruptly. So not only is it short, which could be a plus, could be a minus, but I would say the ending is kind of abrupt, at least in my mind. So you get this story, and it's very kind of not necessarily day to day, but season to season, and so on and so on. But all of a sudden, come chapter 10, so you get Boxer dies, and then all of a sudden it's like years pass, and basically the novel just ends. So Boxer dies, then chapter 10 literally begins. Where is it? Years pass. That's literally the first sentence of chapter 10, and chapter 10 is, what is it? 11 pages, and that's the end. So I guess I'm not conveying this very well, but I mean, you're immersed in the story, and you get all these details, and this and that's happening, and then all of a sudden it's like years passed. Well, what happened in those years? I don't know. And then it's just like, so I thought that ending was a little awkward, maybe that's the way to put it. At least the pacing of it, maybe that's the way I should phrase it, compared to the rest of it. But on the other hand, you've gotten all the messages, you've seen everything transpire. So I don't know what was necessarily left to do, and so maybe that's why he tied it all up with that final 10th chapter in the way that he does. But Boxer dies. Boxer, by the way, I don't know that I talked about Boxer. He's like this workhorse who is like the hard worker, constantly doing the bulk of the effort on the farm. I'll work harder is his like mantra. And then he adopts later, Napoleon is always right. But anyway, all the animals kind of respect him. They can't believe how much work he's able to put in on behalf of everyone. And in the end, he dies though, and he's just sent off to slaughter like it's nothing by the pigs. Of course, everything's portrayed completely differently, but so it's interesting, like this great deal of respect that everyone has for Boxer. He dies. He's abruptly dealt with by the pigs, and then the novel itself just ends. Well, it ends. It's a chapter, right? 11 pages, but then that's it. and I do got to say that I do love the ending of the ending, right? So it was an awkward sort of wait for the whole novel to end, but the very last part, the ending itself, I really do like. Um, because again it captures this idea that in the end, no matter who you put in charge, are you going to come full circle? Um, because the pigs become indistinguishable from the humans, right? The original oppressors. So we get this idea that it doesn't matter who's in charge, you're going to be oppressed. So I love this, the last paragraph. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. So these are some of the other animals that are peering in through the windows and seeing some of the humans playing cards with some of the pigs. And what was funny, what preceded that paragraph was Napoleon and one of the other farmers were both cheating, caught with an ace of spades at the same time. So they're trying to cheat in the same way. So again, this idea that they're one and the same. It doesn't matter who you throw in charge, seemingly, right? One of the implications seems to be it doesn't matter who you put in charge. Are they all liable to be corrupted? Or is that maybe not true? Maybe we could have Plato's philosopher kings in charge and people who don't have this desire to rule in the first place, this idea of the philosopher king, people who supposedly, right, aren't ruled by unnecessary desires and materialism, so they're going to be less likely, in theory, to be corruptible in such a way. But maybe that's in the end idealistic, and Orwell, or at least the implication of Orwell's works, is correct, that it's human nature, that doesn't matter who you put in charge, they can be corrupted, that power will corrupt. So let's go ahead and turn to my book musings grade. I think I've said everything I want to say about the work itself. You probably sensed it by now, but I really liked the novel. I was trying to think of things, other than the abrupt ending, and in some sense, I guess, wishing it was longer because I liked it so much. I really don't have, and also the depressing ending. I would like to walk away with more of a smile. Um, I share a lot of the concerns. I've thought a lot about what he is worried about, Orwell, that is, and so I love it. And so not only does it speak to me philosophically from an ideas sort of sense, but also the story itself is awesome, and he is a great writer. The characters he develops and the plot and so on, that was awesome too. So he brings it all to the table in this book. I would say it's better than 1984, and if you tuned into episode 4, you know that I gave 1984 an A, which means it got into the Book Musings Hall of Fame. So if you're not familiar with the Book Musings Hall of Fame, it's basically any book that I give an A, which is in theory supposed to be like 10%, but who knows what the actual percent is. And then the question is, so if it's better than 1984, and we know that received an A, which gets it into the Book Musings Hall of Fame, does it make the top shelf? So the idea is 10% of the Book Musings Hall of Fame books reach the top shelf. So in theory, the top 1%. Does Animal Farm reach the top shelf? It does. I'm going to give Animal Farm my first ever A+. Kudos to Orwell. You've got 2 works that I've read, or I guess listened to in this instance, and both of them are in the Book Musings Hall of Fame. One has reached even further higher, the top shelf. There we go. And I went out to look, I'm kind of interested to peruse the rest of his writings. You don't hear as much about him, or at least I don't, but is there something, are there treasures there as well? And so I have 4 other things. I don't know if I'll have time to get to these in the near future, but I am interested now. So A+, no denying he's a great writer. if only he had something happier to deliver, which I don't know that that's, a problem with him. It might just be reality, and he's here to deliver a message about reality. Again, I don't know, but third entrant to the Book Musings Hall of Fame, the first entrant onto the top shelf. So he joins, or Animal Farm joins, 1984, and Harry Brown's How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World as the books that I've submitted to the Book Musings Hall of Fame. I guess the last thing I'd talk about is just probably, what's going to be on top. I mentioned Brave New World. I'm about more than 2/3 through this, been listening to it on my runs, so I might do an episode on that. Really enjoying that actually as well. Been working my way through Propaganda. I'm about halfway through that, so that's by Edward Bernays. Finding that really interesting too, and actually the timing. Maybe this was the impetus for me entering 1984 to begin with, but there's a lot of overlap in what's going on here with what's being discussed in these two novels. So the other one I would throw out there as a possibility is We the Living on Rand. I mentioned a few episodes ago that my sister was recommending this one to me, so I do intend to. I'd like to maybe get the audiobook version of this. I do intend to get to this at some point here. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed episode 5 of Book Musings, where I discussed George Orwell and his fantastic Animal Farm. Fantastic indeed. So good I gave it an A+, the first ever top shelf book in the Book Musings Hall of Fame. With that, thank you and stay tuned for episode 6.